His last wish before execution was to thank his ex-prisoner mother. But what happened next would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the justice system and prove that sometimes the most dangerous criminals wear badges instead of orange jumpsuits. I want to see my mother, Sarah Mitchell. She's an ex-convict, served time at Riverside Women's Correctional. Marcus Williams said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The fluorescent lights in the warden's office hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the institutional gray walls that had become Marcus's entire world for the past 7 years. Warden Phillips looked up from his paperwork, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. In 23 years of overseeing executions, he'd heard hundreds of final requests, last meals ranging from elaborate feasts to simple childhood favorites, phone calls to estranged family members, letters to be delivered after death. But he'd never heard a death row inmate specifically mention their parents' criminal record in a final request. The honesty was both jarring and oddly refreshing. Marcus was only 28, but his eyes held the exhaustion of someone who'd fought a losing battle for 7 years. His once athletic frame had grown lean from the restricted prison diet, and premature gray streaks lined his temples, the physical manifestation of stress that no young man should carry. Convicted of murdering Detective James Crawford in what prosecutors called a cold-blooded assassination of a decorated officer, he'd maintained his innocence through every appeal, every court hearing, every sleepless night in his 6-by-8-foot cell. The media had painted him as a cold-blooded cop killer, a dangerous gang affiliate who'd execute a hero in broad daylight. But those who knew him before the arrest remembered a completely different person. A quiet social worker with a master's degree from Howard University who spent his weekends teaching kids in the projects to read, who'd never so much as received a speeding ticket, who'd dedicated his life to breaking the cycle of poverty and violence in his community. "Your mother was released 6 months ago," Warden Phillips said, scrolling through a computer screen, his fingers clicking methodically across the keyboard. "But son, are you sure about this? Most inmates want to protect their families from—" He paused, searching for the right words. From witnessing something like this, it's not easy to watch. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a habit he developed during his years of maintaining composure in the face of injustice. "She's the only person who never stopped believing me, Mr. Phillips. Not my court-appointed lawyer, not my friends, not even my girlfriend who promised to wait. Just her. She deserves to hear me say thank you before." He paused, his voice carrying a weight that made the seasoned warden shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Before they kill an innocent man." The words hung in the air like a challenge, heavy with an accusation that had been repeated countless times within these walls. Phillips had heard similar claims from dozens of condemned men, desperate last-minute protestations of innocence, bargaining attempts, emotional manipulation. But something in Marcus's tone was different. There was no desperation, no last-minute pleading, no theatrical performance for sympathy. Just a quiet certainty that made the seasoned warden genuinely uncomfortable for the first time in years. "We'll arrange it," Phillips said finally, closing the file with more force than necessary. "Visiting room B, 1 hour before the scheduled time. Standard security protocols will apply." What neither man knew was that Sarah Mitchell had spent every single day of her 18-month sentence investigating her son's case from inside prison walls, using resources and connections that the outside world couldn't imagine. What she discovered in the confines of Riverside Women's Correctional would have terrified them both. The truth wasn't just about Marcus's innocence. It was about Detective Crawford's real killer still wearing a badge, still walking free, still collecting a government salary while destroying lives to protect a secret worth millions of dollars. The cramped prison library had become Sarah's second home, where she'd learned to navigate legal databases and file freedom of information requests. Her cellmate Maria Santos, a former investigative journalist wrongfully convicted of exposing mayoral corruption, had taught her how to read between the lines of police reports, how to spot inconsistencies in witness statements, and most importantly, how to build cases that couldn't be buried or dismissed. As Marcus was led back to his cell, the sound of his shackles echoing through the empty corridor, he touched a small piece of paper hidden in his sleeve. The message Sarah had smuggled to him through her former cellmate contained just 4 words, but they were enough to transform his resignation into something resembling hope. "I found the proof. The clock was ticking toward its final hour, and outside the prison walls, news vans were already gathering like vultures, ready to broadcast the execution of the cop killer to a public hungry for justice. But Marcus wasn't thinking about death anymore. He was thinking about justice. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't a gun or a badge or a political influence. It's a mother's love combined with an ex-convict's intimate knowledge of how the system really works when nobody's watching. If you're intrigued by this story of truth versus power, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what Sarah discovered in those prison walls will shake your faith in everything you thought you knew about justice. Sarah Mitchell walked to the prison gates with the measured steps of someone who'd learned to navigate hostile territory with quiet determination. 62 years old, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who'd survived 18 months behind bars for a crime she committed out of desperation, stealing prescription medication she couldn't afford for her dying husband. The arthritis medication had cost more than their monthly grocery budget, and when Robert's pain became unbearable, Sarah made the choice that would change both their lives forever. The irony wasn't lost on her that breaking the law had taught her more about justice than a lifetime of following it ever could. "You look tired, baby," she whispered as she sat across from Marcus in the sterile visiting room, her weathered hands pressing against the plexiglass barrier. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her son's face, highlighting the premature lines that 7 years of fighting a rigged system had carved around his eyes. But her own eyes weren't focused on his exhaustion. They were scanning the room with the practiced awareness of someone who'd learned to notice which guards were within earshot, which cameras had blind spots, and which conversations could be overheard by the wrong people. "Mom, you shouldn't be here. This isn't how I want you to remember me," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly as he studied his mother's face. She looked older, more fragile than when she'd been sentenced, but there was something new in her expression, a sharp intelligence that hadn't been there before, a calculating awareness that reminded him of the social workers he'd trained with who'd learned to navigate impossible bureaucracies. Sarah's jaw tightened with the same stubborn determination that had carried her through every challenge life had thrown at her. "You listen to me, Marcus Williams. I didn't spend a year and a half in that hellhole learning how this corrupt system really works just to watch them murder my innocent son." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, each word carefully chosen. Detective Crawford wasn't the saint they painted him to be in the newspapers. The man was dirty, Marcus, and the person who killed him is still out there, wearing a badge, collecting a government paycheck, and sleeping peacefully every night while you sit on death row. Through the observation window, Detective Ray Morrison watched the interaction with growing unease, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. As the lead investigator on Marcus's case, he'd built his entire career on this conviction. The media had hailed him as a hero for taking down what they called a cold-blooded cop killer. His promotion to detective sergeant, his commendations, his reputation within the department. Everything hinged on Marcus Williams being guilty as charged. What Morrison had expected was for an ex-convict grandmother to start digging into details that were supposed to stay buried under layers of bureaucracy and time. Morrison had been careless 7 years ago, overconfident in ways that now made his stomach churn with anxiety. He'd assumed that a young black social worker with no money for a decent defense attorney would be an easy mark to frame. The planted evidence, the manipulated witness statements, the conveniently lost security footage from a convenience store across the street. It had all worked perfectly at the time. The case had been open and shut, wrapped up in 6 weeks with conviction rate that made his superiors beam with pride. Until now, Sarah's voice grew more urgent, but she kept it low enough that only Marcus could hear clearly. The medical examiner who performed Crawford's autopsy, Dr. Lisa Park, she's in my old cell block now, baby, convicted of insurance fraud, but that's not the interesting part. She paused, glancing almost imperceptibly toward Morrison's position by the window. Turns out she was pressured to alter her findings 7 years ago. Crawford wasn't killed the way they said in court. The angle of the bullet trajectory, the estimated time of death, the powder burn patterns, everything in that autopsy report was wrong, deliberately wrong. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, like a door that had been locked for 7 years, suddenly creaking open. For so long, he'd been fighting a battle he couldn't win, Watching appeals get denied on technicalities. Watching his court-appointed lawyers give up after perfunctory efforts. Watching the system grind him down one procedural defeat at a time. But seeing his mother's fierce determination, hearing the specific details she'd uncovered, he realized something that filled him with emotion he'd almost forgotten. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. There's more, and this is the part that's going to make you angry, Sarah continued, her eyes now locked directly on Morrison through the glass. That detective watching us right now, Ray Morrison, he was Crawford's partner for 6 years. And according to my source, a woman who used to work in the evidence locker before they fired her for asking too many questions. They weren't investigating drug dealers that night like the reports claimed. They were planning to steal from them. Morrison's hand instinctively moved toward his service weapon, a nervous habit he developed whenever he felt cornered. The conversation was going on too long, becoming too intense. He could see Sarah Mitchell's lips moving, could see the way Marcus's posture had changed from resignation to alertness. Through his radio earpiece, he quietly called for additional security. We might have a developing situation in visiting room B. Inmate Williams appears agitated. Marcus noticed Morrison's sudden movement, the way other guards were subtly repositioning themselves around the room. His years as a social worker had taught him to read body language, to spot escalating tension before it boiled over into violence. "Mom," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Morrison, "I think we're running out of time. He knows you're telling me something important." Sarah smiled for first time in months, and Marcus saw something in her expression that made his heart race. Not fear, but anticipation. "No, baby, we're not running out of time. We're just getting started." She leaned even closer to the glass, her voice barely audible. "Because what that arrogant, murderous fool over there doesn't know is that I didn't just find one witness in prison. I found 12 women who've been betrayed by this system, and every single one of them is ready to help bring down the cops who destroyed their lives." The visiting time buzzer rang with its harsh electronic tone, but neither mother nor son made any move to end their conversation. Morrison was approaching their booth now, his face a carefully controlled mask that barely concealed his growing panic. His entire world was starting to crack, and he could feel it. What Morrison didn't realize was that Sarah Mitchell had spent 18 months learning from the best teachers in the world when it came to fighting corruption. Women who'd been betrayed, framed, and abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Women who'd had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from seeing justice finally served. And now, with less than 12 hours until her son's execution, Sarah was about to demonstrate exactly what a mother's love could accomplish when it was armed with the truth, fueled by righteous anger, and supported by a network of women who understood that sometimes the system only responds to the kind of pressure that comes from the inside out. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to come with me." Detective Morrison's voice cut through the visiting room like a blade. 2 additional officers flanked him, their hands resting casually on their tasers. There's been a security concern. Sarah didn't flinch. 18 months in Riverside Women's Correctional had taught her to recognize intimidation tactics from men who thought they held all the power. "Of course, detective. But first, let me say goodbye to my son." She pressed her palm against the glass one more time, and Marcus noticed something he'd never seen before, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't resignation. It was anticipation. "Remember what I taught you about chess when you were little?" Sarah said, her voice carrying just loud enough for Morrison to hear. "The queen is the most powerful piece on the board, but nobody pays attention to her until it's too late." As the guards led Sarah away, Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. Something in her tone suggested she wasn't just reminiscing about childhood games. Through his earpiece, he barked orders. "I want her cell phone, her belongings, everything searched. Now!" But what Morrison didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had learned more than just how to survive in prison. She'd learned from women like Maria Santos, a former investigative journalist who'd been convicted of exposing corruption in the mayor's office. Maria had taught her how to build cases that couldn't be buried, how to create paper trails that led investigators exactly where you wanted them to go. The packages Sarah mentioned weren't just going to news stations. They were going to the FBI's Internal Affairs Division, the Attorney General's office, and most importantly, to Judge Patricia Chun, the same judge who'd originally wanted to recuse herself from Marcus's case due to concerns about the evidence presentation. At 3:17 a.m., Judge Shin sat in her home office, reading through documents that made her stomach turn. Witness statements that had been altered, crime scene photos that didn't match the official reports, and most damning of all, financial records showing Detective Morrison had made 3 large cash deposits in the weeks following Marcus's conviction, deposits that coincided with the seizure of drug money from other cases. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Judge Chun, this is Sarah Mitchell. My son dies in 8 hours unless you act. The evidence is real. Morrison killed Crawford during a drug robbery gone wrong. The medical examiner who can confirm this is Dr. Lisa Park, currently in protective custody. She's ready to testify. Chen's hands trembled as she reached for her secure phone line. She'd suspected something was wrong with the Williams case years ago, but the pressure to uphold a conviction had been overwhelming. Now, with less than 8 hours before the execution, she had a choice that would define the rest of her career. Meanwhile, back at the prison, Morrison was discovering that Sarah's belongings contained nothing more than a worn Bible and a photograph of Marcus graduating from college. No phone, no hidden documents, nothing that explained her confidence. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the echoes of her words about chess queens. What he didn't realize was that Sarah's real weapon wasn't hidden in her belongings. It was walking free in the outside world. Dr. Lisa Park, the medical examiner who'd falsified Crawford's autopsy report into Morrison's threats, had spent 2 years living in fear. But when Sarah's former cellmate had contacted her with an offer for protection in exchange for the truth, she'd finally found the courage to speak. At 4:45 a.m., Judge Shin made the call that would change everything. Warden Phillips, this is Judge Patricia Chun. I'm issuing an emergency stay of execution for Marcus Williams, effective immediately. New evidence has come to light that requires immediate investigation. In his cell, Marcus felt the shift in the prison's atmosphere before anyone told him what was happening. The footsteps in the corridors had changed from the slow march toward an execution to the urgent pace of people trying to prevent one. When Warden Phillips appeared at his cell door with news of the stay, Marcus's first thought wasn't relief. It was of admiration for a 62-year-old woman who'd turned 18 months in prison into a masterclass in justice. But this was only the beginning, because while Morrison scrambled to contain the damage and discredit Sarah's evidence, he had no idea that the chess game was already 3 moves ahead of him, and the queen he'd underestimated was about to deliver checkmate with the help of allies he never knew existed. At 6:30 a.m., Detective Ray Morrison's world began to crumble with a single phone call. Ray, it's Chief Patterson. We need you at headquarters. Now, don't bring your weapon. The tone was different. Cold. Professional. The kind of voice superiors used when they were about to end careers. Morrison's hands trembled as he hung up, his mind racing through damage control scenarios. Sarah Mitchell was just an ex-convict with wild theories. Dr. Park wouldn't dare speak up after all these years. Judge Shin was probably just being overly cautious. He was wrong on every count. When Morrison walked into the headquarters conference room, he found himself facing FBI Internal Affairs Agent Victoria Reyes, District Attorney Michael Torres, and a video screen showing Dr. Lisa Park sitting in what appeared to be a secure location. On the table before them lay thick manila folders, USB drives, and photographs that made Morrison's blood run cold. Detective Morrison, Agent Reyes began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years bringing down corrupt cops. We're here to discuss the murder of Detective James Crawford and the wrongful conviction of Marcus Williams. Dr. Park's voice came through the speakers, shaky but determined. I want to formally recant my autopsy findings in the Crawford case. Detective Morrison threatened my family if I didn't alter the time of death and the bullet trajectory analysis. The real cause of death was consistent with a struggle between 2 people who knew each other, not a random attack by a stranger. Morrison's lawyer instincts kicked in. This is ridiculous. A convicted felon's mother and a disgraced medical examiner trying to... Save it, Ray. Chief Patterson slid a photograph across the table. It showed Morrison and Crawford in what appeared to be a heated argument outside a warehouse 3 weeks before Crawford's death. This was taken by a surveillance camera that you thought had been disabled. We found it yesterday in an evidence locker that somehow got misfiled. The net was closing. Agent Reyes opened the first folder. Financial records show you made 3 cash deposits totaling $47,000 in the month following Marcus Williams' conviction. The same amount that went missing from the evidence room during the Garcia drug bust. A case Crawford was questioning you about. Morrison's face went pale. Crawford had been his partner for 6 years, but in the final months, James had become suspicious. Too many missing evidence bags. Too many cases where Morrison's reports didn't match the physical evidence. The night Crawford died, he confronted Morrison with proof of the thefts, demanding they turn themselves in together. James was going to destroy both our careers over some drug money that was going to get lost in the system anyway. Morrison said, his carefully constructed facade finally cracking. I just needed him to see reason. Torres leaned forward. So you killed him and framed an innocent man for it. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Morrison's voice rose to a near shout. James pulled his weapon first. We struggled. The gun went off. When I realized he was dead, I panicked. I planted the gun in Williams' car, got Dr. Park to change the autopsy report, made sure the witness statements lined up. The room fell silent except for the whir of recording equipment capturing every word. Outside, news vans were already gathering as word leaked about the dramatic developments in the Marcus Williams case. Agent Reyes stood up. Detective Ray Morrison, you're under arrest for the murder of Detective James Crawford, evidence tampering, perjury, and conspiracy to commit murder. As the handcuffs clicked around Morrison's wrists, he looked up at the video screen where Dr. Park watched with tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I should have told the truth 7 years ago. Meanwhile, at the state penitentiary, Marcus Williams was finally walking out his cell as a free man. The charges against him had been formally dropped 20 minutes earlier. Sarah Mitchell stood waiting in the visitor's parking lot, holding a newspaper with the headline, Corrupt Cop Confesses. Death row inmate exonerated after 7 years. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus's court-appointed attorney from 7 years ago, the same man who'd barely fought the charges and convinced Marcus to take a plea deal, called to offer his services for the inevitable civil lawsuit. Marcus's response was simple. I already have representation. My mother knows some very good lawyers she met in prison. The truth had taken 7 years to surface, but when it finally emerged, it brought down not just Morrison, but the entire network of officials who'd been complicit in the cover-up. Because Sarah Mitchell hadn't just found evidence of her son's innocence. She'd uncovered a corruption scandal that would shake the foundation of the entire justice system, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is a mother who refuses to give up and an ex-convict who knows exactly how broken the system really is. 2 years after walking out of death row as a free man, Marcus Williams stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown Law School, delivering the keynote address on criminal justice, reformed to an audience that hung on every word. The same man who'd once been 24 hours from lethal injection was now a nationally recognized advocate, his case having sparked legislation in 12 states requiring mandatory DNA testing and independent review boards before any execution could proceed. The auditorium was standing room only, filled with law students whose textbooks now included his case as a landmark example of systemic failure and eventual justice. In the back row sat journalists who covered his story from the beginning, federal judges who'd learned from the mistakes of his case, and activists who'd used his experience to push for broader reforms. The system didn't fail me, Marcus told the audience of law students, professors, civil rights activists, and legal scholars. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd survived the worst the justice system could offer and emerged with his humanity intact. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work, to convict poor people, especially poor black people, regardless of the evidence. What saved me wasn't the system fixing itself. It was my mother refusing to accept that the system was right. In the front row sat Sarah Mitchell, now 64, wearing the proud smile of a woman who'd turned her lowest moment into her greatest triumph. The woman who'd once stolen medication out of desperation had become a sought-after consultant for prisoner advocacy groups across the country. Her expertise in navigating the system from the inside, understanding how information flowed through prison networks, how to build trust with inmates who've been betrayed by authority figures, how to access legal resources that most people didn't know existed, had proven invaluable to families fighting wrongful convictions. Her book, Letters from Inside, A Mother's Fight for Justice, had spent 14 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was being adapted into a documentary by award-winning filmmaker Ava DuVernay. The book detailed not just Marcus's case, but the stories of 12 other women she'd met in prison whose own families had been destroyed by corruption and false convictions. Detective Ray Morrison, meanwhile, was serving life without parole in the same maximum security prison where Marcus had awaited execution. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially the correctional officers who remembered Marcus's quiet dignity during his 7 years on death row. Morrison's conviction had opened the floodgates on other cases he'd worked, leading to 17 additional convictions being overturned and 3 more corrupt officers being indicted. His pension had been revoked retroactively, his assets seized to pay restitution to his victims, and his wife had divorced him within 6 months of his conviction. The house they'd bought with the stolen drug money had been sold at auction, with the proceeds going to a victim compensation fund. Morrison spent his days in protective custody, despised by both guards and inmates who had no tolerance for corrupt cops. Dr. Lisa Park had found her path to redemption through truth-telling and had become one of the most respected voices in forensic pathology reform. After testifying against Morrison, she left her position as a medical examiner and now worked full-time with the Innocence Project, using her expertise to review questionable autopsy reports from across the country. Her work had contributed to overturning 14 additional murder convictions where forensic evidence had been manipulated or misinterpreted. The guilt of her silence had nearly destroyed her marriage and her mental health, but helping other innocent people had become her way of healing. She'd established the Park Foundation for Forensic Integrity, which provided training for medical examiners on resisting pressure from law enforcement and maintaining scientific independence in their findings. Judge Patricia Chun, who'd issued the critical stay of execution, had gone on to establish the Chin Foundation for Criminal Justice Reform, funded partly by Marcus's 8-figure settlement with the state. Her courage in stopping the execution despite enormous political pressure had earned her national recognition and ultimately a nomination to the Federal Appeals Court, where she now served with distinction. The foundation had created legal clinics in 10 major cities, staffed by attorneys who specialized in wrongful conviction cases. These clinics provided free legal services to inmates who couldn't afford private counsel, filling a gap that had allowed cases like Marcus's to slip through the cracks for years. But perhaps the most satisfying moment in the entire ordeal came during Morrison's sentencing hearing, when Marcus was allowed to address the court as a victim of Morrison's crimes. The courtroom was packed with media, victims' families, and advocates who'd followed the case. Instead of anger or hatred, Marcus spoke with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout his 7-year ordeal. 7 years ago, Detective Morrison thought he could destroy an innocent man to save himself, Marcus said, looking directly at his former accuser, who sat slumped in his chair with his eyes fixed on the floor. He thought my life was disposable, that no one would care enough to fight for the truth. He was wrong on every count. The truth has a way of surviving, even when buried under lies, corruption, and institutional indifference. And sometimes it takes a mother's love and an ex-convict's determination to dig it up. The packed courtroom erupted in sustained applause as Morrison was led away in chains, the same chains Marcus had worn for 7 years. But Marcus felt no joy in Morrison's downfall, only a profound relief that justice had finally prevailed and that no other innocent person would fall victim to Morrison's corruption. The ripple effects of the case continued to spread throughout the justice system. The police department underwent a complete overhaul of its evidence handling procedures. The district attorney's office implemented new protocols for reviewing convictions where prosecutorial misconduct was suspected. The state legislature passed the Marcus Williams Wrongful Conviction Prevention Act, which required independent testing of all DNA evidence in death penalty cases. Today, the Marcus Williams Center for Wrongful Conviction Defense operates in 3 states, with plans to expand to 5 more within the next 2 years. The center is staffed largely by formerly incarcerated individuals who understand the system's failures from personal experience. Sarah Mitchell serves as its executive director, Having earned her law degree through a prison education program during her incarceration, a degree she completed the same week Marcus was arrested. People ask me if I'm angry about the 7 years they stole from my son, Sarah reflected during a recent interview for 60 Minutes. Her voice steady, but her eyes flashing with the fire that had sustained her through the darkest days. I tell them anger is a luxury we couldn't afford. We had work to do. Every day Marcus spent on death row was another day we spent learning how to tear down the walls they built to keep the truth buried. The center had already secured the exoneration of 6 other wrongfully convicted individuals, with 12 more cases under active investigation. Marcus had been appointed to the state's Criminal Justice Reform Commission, where he worked on policy changes to prevent future wrongful convictions. His personal life had also found healing. He'd married Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a criminal justice professor who'd testified as an expert witness in his appeal. Together, they were raising 2 children in the same neighborhood where Marcus had worked as a social worker before his arrest, a deliberate choice to show the community that it was possible to rebuild after injustice. The story of Marcus Williams proves that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice preparing to strike with devastating accuracy. Morrison tried to destroy Marcus, but ended up destroying only himself. Marcus learned that the greatest revenge isn't making your enemies pay for their crimes. It's succeeding so completely that their crimes become footnotes in your triumph. The case had fundamentally changed how the justice system handled death penalty cases, created new safeguards against prosecutorial misconduct, and inspired a generation of advocates to fight for the innocent. But perhaps most importantly, it had proven that even in the darkest corners of the system, truth and love could still triumph over corruption and hatred. And if the story of truth conquering corruption, of a mother's love overcoming impossible odds, and of an innocent man's quiet dignity in the face of injustice moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of justice, resilience, and the power of never giving up. Because sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who refuse to let the system have the last word, and sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to stop believing in the truth.